The mountain stood cold and indifferent as she climbed the trail with everything she owned on her back. The cabin waited at the end of it, weathered logs and intact windows, as if someone had left in a hurry. She touched the door. A low growl rolled out from inside, deep in warning. She pushed it open an inch. Golden eyes met hers in the dim light. The mountain lion didn't lunge. It stood its ground, blocking whatever was in the room behind it. The birds had stopped singing. The wind held its breath. From the trees came the faint creak of leather and the shift of a horse's weight. Someone watching, deciding. She sat on the porch step without drawing her knife. The lion stayed in the doorway. Under the floor, the cedar box waited in the dark. Colorado. October 1880. The mountains didn't care who you were. They didn't care if you were tall. Didn't care if the whole town called you something that wasn't quite a compliment. Didn't care if you'd spent the last 2 years sleeping on one side of a bed that used to hold 2 people, and now just held you, and a grief so heavy it had its own weight, its own smell, its own sound at 3 in the morning. The mountains just stood there. And Martha Calloway had always found that to be the most honest thing about them. She was 43 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch of woman in a world that had decided 5'4" was the appropriate height for a lady. Her hands were rough from 15 years of ranger work. Her boots were broken and past the point where most women would have bought new ones. Her coat was her husband's. Thomas had been nearly her height, which was one of the first things she'd loved about him. And she hadn't been able to bring herself to replace it. She was carrying everything she owned on her back, which wasn't much. Which was fine. Which was exactly what she'd chosen. The lawyer's office in Denver had smelled like pipe smoke and old paper. She'd stood in front of a small man behind a large desk, and he'd slid a document across to her like he was nervous about something. Silver Peak Cabin. He'd said, $5. Legal transfer from one Elias Drum. She hadn't recognized the name. She'd told him so. The lawyer had cleared his throat, shuffled some papers that didn't need shuffling, then said the thing that had changed everything. Mr. Drum left a personal message, he said. The lawyer glanced at a separate folded paper. He said he knows what pattern Thomas carved on the box he gave Rose for her birthday, and he said you'd understand why that matters. Martha had gone very still. Not calm. The opposite of calm. The kind of still that happened when something reached through your chest and grabbed hold of something it had no business touching. Nobody knew about that box. Thomas had carved it in the shed, alone, 3 nights before Rose's 16th birthday. A small bird, wings open, mid-flight. He'd shown it to Martha that morning with sawdust still on his shirt, and she'd cried a little, and he'd pretended not to notice, which was how they handled most things. Rose had kept it on her windowsill. Martha had packed it in her trunk after the funeral. Hadn't opened the trunk since. She'd signed the document, paid the $5, and walked out of that office into the cold October air without asking another single question, because she'd learned that sometimes the questions could wait, and the moving had to happen first. The walk up to Silver Peak took 4 hours. 4 hours of pine forest thickening around her. 4 hours of the trail getting narrower and steeper and more serious about itself. 4 hours of her own breathing, going from steady to labored, to the particular rhythm that comes from altitude and grief, and the specific physical effort of choosing to keep going when nothing is requiring you to. She didn't stop once. 15 years in the backcountry had made her body good at this. Her legs knew how to climb without complaint. Her lungs knew how to adjust. Her eyes moved the way ranger eyes move, reading the ground, reading the trees, reading the sky for weather that wasn't there yet but was thinking about arriving. October in the Colorado mountains. Early cold. The peaks above her already showing white. The air carrying that particular sharpness that meant the season had made up its mind. She crossed a creek 2 miles in. The water was clear and fast, and cold enough to make her teeth ache when she cupped a handful. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the ridge. A squirrel had opinions about her presence and shared them loudly from a pine branch. The forest was doing what forests do, continuing, without apology or explanation. without caring that she'd sold the house, and Thomas's woodworking tools and Rose's college letters and everything else that had once made up the shape of her life. She found that genuinely comforting, which probably said something about her. She wasn't sure what. The cabin appeared through the trees like something remembered rather than discovered. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at it. Weathered. That was the word. Weathered the way things get when they've been standing a long time and the weather has been honest with them about it. But the roof was sound. She could see that from here. The logs were solid. The windows were intact. Not the glass of a place abandoned to the elements. The glass of a place that had been maintained and then left. Someone had taken care of this, and then stopped. The porch boards were sound under her feet when she climbed the thrisps. She noticed where repairs had been made to the railing. Recent repairs. Clean wood under old wood. Someone had been here within the last year. Maybe less. She stood at the door, reached for the handle, and heard it low, rumbling, from the other side of the door, a sound that moved through the wood, and into her hand, and up her arm, and settled, somewhere in the base of her spine, where the oldest parts of a person keep their most important information. She didn't move, neither did what was inside. She pushed the door open, slowly, inches, just enough. The gap gave her darkness and the smell of animal. Warm, musky, alive, and then a pair of eyes, golden, steady, reflecting the late afternoon light like two small lanterns in the dark. Mountain lion female, from the size and shape of the head, full grown, not young and foolish, not old and desperate. Exactly the age and weight of something that had made its decisions carefully and didn't regret them. She wasn't growling anymore. She was just watching. Martha stood in the doorway for a very long moment and had a conversation with herself that went something like, "This is a 120-pound predator, and you have no firearm within reach, and the sensible thing would be to back slowly off this porch and give the situation some space and time and basic respect." And then the other part of herself said, "She's not moving to attack. She's positioned defensively. There's something behind her she's protecting." And the first part said, "That's exactly what makes this dangerous." And the second part said, I know it is." Martha took one step back, sat down on the porch step, not advancing, just existing in the same space, without demanding anything from it. The lion watched her. She watched the lion. The sun moved. The shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped the way it does in the mountains when the light starts going, sudden and serious. Martha said quietly, to no one in particular, "I'm not here to take anything from you." The lion's ears moved. Not the full alert position of a threatened animal. Something else. Something that looked almost like consideration. "I've got nowhere else to be," Martha added. "So I'll just sit here." She pulled her coat tighter. Thomas's coat still smelled faintly of cedar and pine resin and the particular warmth of him. She'd washed it twice and it still held something in the fabric. She didn't know if that was a comfort or a torment. Some days it was one, some days the other, some days both at the same time in a way that didn't have a name. The lion pulled back from the door. Not gone. Just further in, Martha exhaled, stayed on the step. When the dark came fully, she unrolled her bedroll. On the far end of the porch, ate cold biscuits from her pack, drank water from her canteen, and went to sleep under the stars with a mountain lion on the other side of a thin plank door. She slept better than she had in months. She woke before dawn to frost on her bedroll and the feeling of being watched. The lion was at the window. Not pressing against it, not threatening, just there, head tilted slightly. That same quality of attention, thorough, patient evaluating. "Good morning," Martha said. The lion blinked, once, turned her head toward the forest. Martha followed her gaze. Nothing obvious. The trees dark and still in the pre-dawn gray. The first birds starting their noise. The creek somewhere below steady and indifferent. She got up, moved slowly, deliberately, the way she'd learned to move around wildlife over 15 years. Not sneaking, not stomping, just existing at a volume the animals could accept. The porch wrapped around the eastern side of the cabin. She hadn't seen that in yesterday's failing light. And in the corner, behind a growth of mountain laurel that had been doing its best to reclaim the foundation, something wooden, cedar, wedged between two large stones at the base of the cabin wall. She knelt. It was a box, not large, about the size of a small Bible. The cedar was weathered on the outside, but the joints were tight and precise, the joinery of someone who cared about what they were making beyond just making it function. Someone who understood that the how of a thing mattered as much as the what. Thomas had built things this way. Her hands weren't quite steady when she reached for it. On the lid, carved in careful shallow relief, a bird, small, wings fully open, mid-flight, the same bird, exactly the same bird. She sat down in the mountain laurel without caring about the branches. She sat down because her legs had decided to stop participating in standing up, and she respected that decision. The box was heavier than it looked. Something shifted inside when she moved it. She worked the latch, wood swollen with weather, for several long minutes before it gave way. Inside, maps. More than a dozen of them, hand-drawn in careful ink and pencil. Some of them professionally printed with survey markings. Geological assessments with notation that meant nothing to her on first pass. And beneath the maps, folded papers covered in handwriting. The handwriting of someone who wrote with precision, someone educated, someone who'd trained to record things accurately and knew the difference between what they observed and what they concluded. She opened the letter first. Mrs. Calloway. You don't know me. My name is Elias Drum. I was a friend of Thomas's when we were both young and foolish and thought we were going to live forever. We lost touch the way men do when life goes in different directions. I became a federal detective. He became a ranger and then a husband and then a father, and I think he got the better end of that bargain. I've been watching this mountain for 3 years. What I've found here matters. I can't explain it fully in a letter, but the documents in this box in the room beneath the cabin floor will show you what I've found, and why it cannot fall into certain hands. But that's not why I chose you. I chose you because of the bridge. I don't believe Thomas died by accident. I don't believe Rose died by accident. I believe the bridge at Redstone Creek was made to fail, and I believe I know why, and I believe I know who gave the order. I'm not certain enough to put a name to paper yet, but I'm close. I chose you because you have 15 years of wilderness skills and federal authority. Because you know how to read evidence and how to cup your head when a situation becomes difficult. Because you have nothing left to protect except the truth. And because if I'm right about what happened, you deserve to know. The rest is in the room beneath the floor. Elias Drum P.S. I taught myself to carve that bird by studying Rose's box. Thomas described it to me once, in a letter he wrote when she was 12. I wanted you to know. The box came from someone who understood what it meant. Martha sat in the mountain laurel for a long time. The sky went from gray to pink to gold. The birds got louder. The frost on the pine needles caught the first light and turned briefly, extravagantly silver. She read the letter again. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the cedar box, and sat with it in her hands. I don't believe Thomas died by accident. 2 years. 2 years of being told it was the rain and the dark and the curve in the road and the weight of the wagon and the particular awful randomness of the world that takes people. 2 years of a story that was sad but sensible. That had a shape she could hold. That had a shape she could hold. That fit into the category of things that happened because they happened and not because someone decided they should. And now this stranger was handing her a different shape entirely. She noticed her hands had stopped shaking, which was interesting. She would have expected the shaking to get worse. Instead, she felt something settle in her. Something that had been loose for 2 years clicking into a kind of grim alignment. Not hope exactly. Purpose, those were different things. She got up, brushed the mountain laurel off her coat, picked up the cedar box and tucked it under her arm. All right, she said to no one in particular, or maybe to Thomas. She wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. Then she went back to the cabin. The lion was still at the window. Martha nodded at her, once like one neighbor acknowledging another. The lion watched, didn't move. Martha went around to the door. The porch boards were sound under her feet. She tested each one as she walked, old Ranger habit, assessing what she was standing on. All solid. The repair work on the railing was better up close than it had looked from a distance. Whoever Elias Drum was, he built things to last. She went in. The interior was dim and cold, and smelled of old wood and stone, and something animal and alive from deeper in. The main room was larger than she'd expected. Stone fireplace on one wall, dark and clean swept, with evidence of recent use in the staining of the stone. Bookshelves on two walls, volumes still upright and ordered. Geology and land survey texts, and something that looked like legal documents in bound folders. A desk by the window with papers weighted under a river stone. Instruments she recognized as surveying tools, and some she didn't. It was not the chaos of abandonment. It was the order of someone who'd left in a hurry or been made to. She put the cedar box on the desk and started looking at the main room with Ranger eyes, the kind of eyes that had spent 15 years reading scenes, reading what had happened and what it meant. The fireplace, used recently but not today. Cold ash, but clean ash. Someone who banked their fires properly. The desk, papers in mid-work. An interrupted project, not a finished one. The handwriting on the loose papers matched the letter. The bookshelf. One gap, one absent volume, leaving a space slightly wider than a book. Not empty from the beginning, taken. Recently enough that the dust pattern showed the shape of what had been there. The front door. The latch was worn on one side in a way that said left-handed. Elias Drum was left-handed, which meant the writing in the letter would lean slightly right. Which it did. She was doing what she always did, building a picture out of details. One detail at a time until a shape emerged. She moved to the interior, narrow hallway, a bedroom beyond where she could hear, very faintly, a sound like soft crying. Cubs, of course. The lion had chosen this bedroom for her young, and she'd placed herself between those cubs and the world with the deliberate geometry of a mother who understood threat, assessment. Martha stopped at the bedroom door. "Didn't open it, your babies," she said quietly. To the lion, who was presumably somewhere nearby, "I understand. Nobody's going near your babies." She turned back to the main room and stopped. Because she was standing in front of the fireplace and her foot had landed slightly wrong on one of the floorboards. A tiny give, a movement that shouldn't have been there in boards this well-maintained. She stepped back, looked down. The board was indistinguishable from its neighbors, unless you knew to look for the scratches along its edges. Fine scratches, consistent, from something metal, repeated over time. She got down on one knee, pressed along the edges with her fingers, found the slight depression on the right side, like a grip worn into the wood. She lifted it. Darkness and the smell of earth and something chemical. Minerals, she thought, or the particular cold smell of deep stone. A wooden stair disappeared down into it. The stairs were sound, braced against stone on either side. She went back to her pack, got the oil lamp she'd brought and lit it. Then she went down. The room below was extraordinary, carved from the mountain itself. Stone walls that had been worked and smoothed in places, left rough in others. Support beams of heavy timber, properly mortised and pegged. A professional job, years of work. This hadn't been dug in a season. It was filled along the walls, rock samples in labeled wooden crates. Each label written in the same careful hand, coordinates, elevation, date, composition notes. Some of the samples gleamed even in lamplight. Veins of silver running through gray rock like rivers seen from a great height. Equipment. A core sample drill. Compact but real. The kind that cost more than most men made in a year. Mineral analysis tools she recognized from her ranger training. Survey instruments of a quality she'd never personally handled. And in the corner, a metal filing cabinet. Padlocked. She held the lamp up and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked around the room as a whole. Elias Drum had been building this for years, quietly, carefully, without anyone knowing. He'd found something significant beneath this mountain. Something worth documenting with thoroughness that only made sense if you believed someone was going to try to take it away from you, or already was. She was still looking at the filing cabinet, thinking about how to get into it without the key. when she heard it from above, hoofbeats, not one horse, not a rider passing through. Multiple horses, moving together, at a pace that was purposeful without being panicked. Approaching the cabin, she blew out the lamp, stood in the dark for a moment, listening. The hoofbeats slowed, stopped, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. Judging by the muffled sound through the earth above her, voices, too low to make out words. But the tone was professional, organized, the tone of men who discussed what they were doing before they got here. Martha climbed the stairs as quietly as she could. Didn't replace the floorboard. She might need to go back down fast. Moved to the window beside the fireplace and looked out through the gap where the curtain didn't quite reach. 4 men on horseback, all armed. She could see the rifle scabbards. Good horses, well kept. The men were dressed for serious outdoor work, not a casual ride wide. One of them, sitting his horse slightly apart from the others, the particular body language of command, was scanning the clearing with methodical attention, checking windows, checking the door. His gaze moved the way trained eyes move. He was looking for signs of recent occupation. Martha stepped back from the window. The floor didn't creak under her. Good boards, well built. She looked at the open floorboard, at the cedar box on the desk. At the door, she thought about the lion in the bedroom and the cubs behind her, and the 4 armed men outside. She thought about Elias Drum's letter. About I don't believe Thomas died by accident. She thought about 2 years of sleeping on one side of a bed. 2 years of a story that had a shape that had just changed completely. Then she moved. Quiet and deliberate. She grabbed the cedar box in her pack, crossed to the floorboard, and went back down. She didn't make a sound. Above her, she heard boots on the porch steps. She heard the door open. She stood in the dark below the cabin and listened to the men move through the rooms above her. And she held very still, and she thought, "All right, Thomas, I'm paying attention now." The boots moved through the main room. 2 pairs, from the sound of it, systematic. Unhurried, the sound of men who've done this before and aren't concerned about being interrupted. "Nothing recent," one voice said, low. "Professional, check the back room." Another answered. A pause. Then the sound that Martha had been half expecting and half dreading, the low, deep, warning growl of a mountain lion who had just had men walk toward her children. It stopped both pairs of boots immediately. Hell, this voice controlled, easy. The first voice again, steady, back up, slowly. Is that a back up, shuffling, careful retreat? The boots moved away from the hallway. The growling stopped. But the warning in it, hadn't. Martha exhaled very slowly, above her. The 2 men were talking in lower voices now. She caught fragments. "Den in there. Cubs, sounds like." Not getting past that. The second voice, the one she'd identified as command, said something she couldn't hear. Then louder. "Check the perimeter, all of it. Foundation. Outbuildings if there are any. More boots." Moving outside, around the cabin, she listened to them move above her and around her, the sound shifting as they passed over different sections of ground. She tracked them the way she'd tracked animals for 15 years. Not a different skill, as it turned out. She heard them stop near the eastern corner of the foundation, very close to where she'd found the cedar box in the mountain laurel. She heard the sound of boots on the porch again. Then inside. Then standing directly above her, she looked up at the floorboard she'd left open. There was a gap. Not large, but in the right light with the right eyes. She held her breath. The boots moved past the fireplace, back toward the door. "Nothing inside worth noting," the first voice said. "Old equipment. Looks like it's been empty a season or more." "Long enough," the commanding voice said. And then, quieter, way that made the hair on Martha's neck stand. "Come back tomorrow. Do a full survey." The boots went out. The door closed. She stood in the dark and waited while the voices outside moved away. Waited while the hoofbeats organized themselves and began to recede down the mountain trail. Waited until she couldn't hear them at all, and then waited some more, because she'd learned patience was the thing that kept you alive. In the backcountry, when something was hunting and you didn't want to be found. When she finally came back up, the cabin was exactly as she'd left it. She went to the window. The clearing was empty. The lion was in the doorway of the bedroom, watching her. Those golden eyes steady and serious. "I know," Martha said quietly. "They'll come back." The lion didn't move. "Tomorrow," he said. Martha looked down at the cedar box in her hands, at the maps and the letter, and whatever was locked inside that filing cabinet downstairs that Elias Drum had trusted enough to padlock. She looked out the window at the mountain. The late afternoon light had gone from gold to something flatter and cooler. The peaks above showed more white than they had yesterday. The weather that had been thinking about arriving was making its decision. She needed to understand what she was standing in the middle of. She needed to know what Elias had found beneath this mountain, and why 4 armed men were treating an abandoned cabin like a strategic target. And she needed to do it before they came back. She set the cedar box on the desk and went back to the floorboard, went down, found the filing cabinet, examined the padlock with her lamp held close. A good lock, heavy gauge, meant seriously. She'd worked enough locked gates and seized equipment caches and secured wilderness storage facilities in her years to know that padlocks had 2 enemies: their own mechanisms and the things they were attached to. This lock was sound, but the bracket it was bolted through was old iron, and the filing cabinet itself was older still, and the bolts had been in contact with mountain air and Colorado winters. For however many years, Elias had owned this place. She went back up. Got the small pry bar from her pack. Always carry a pry bar. 15 years of fieldwork had taught her that, and went back down. It took 8 minutes. She counted. The bracket gave first. The drawer came open with the particular sigh of pressurized air. Something had been sealing it. And the smell that came out was paper and metal, and something faintly chemical. She couldn't name. She held the lamp close and looked inside. Maps, more detailed than the ones in the cedar box. Overlapping surveys showing something she began to understand slowly, one map at a time, as she spread them on the stone floor of the room. The mineral deposits beneath Silver Peak were extensive, more extensive than any survey she'd seen in her time with the federal rangers. Silver, yes. But the geological assessments noted something else alongside. Elements she didn't have the scientific vocabulary for, but that the notes described with language suggesting serious value. Conservative estimate, Elias had written in the margin of one assessment, places recoverable value at 40 million, possibly double. This estimate assumes responsible extraction. Strip methods would yield more in the short term, and render the entire watershed uninhabitable within a decade. $40 million. In 1880, she sat with that for a moment, then she found the second folder, tucked behind the surveys, thinner, closed with a piece of string tied in a knot she recognized, a specific ranger's knot, the kind they were taught in federal training. Thomas had known that knot. She undid it carefully. Inside, correspondence, letters, several of them. And then at the back, something that wasn't a letter at all, a diagram, hand-drawn, showing a bridge, showing a specific structural element, a support beam at the main span, showing in careful notation exactly where a cut would need to be made to ensure failure under load. Not immediate failure, delayed failure. The kind that happened under the weight of a wagon on a wet night, when the wood had been quietly compromised for weeks. Beneath the diagram, in Elias's precise handwriting, confirmed via examination of recovered timber, October 1878. Cut consistent with fine-toothed saw, not fracture. The failure was engineered. I have the timber section. I have a witness who will not yet speak. The order for this came from someone with sufficient resources to employ a professional and sufficient influence to close the subsequent inquiry. I know who this is. I am not yet certain enough to commit the name to paper. Without corroboration, I do not yet have. Martha's hands were very steady. She noticed this about herself with a kind of detached clarity. She'd expected to shake. She'd expected some physical response to reading words that rearranged the last 2 years of her life into an entirely different shape. Instead, she felt like a river that had found its channel. She read it again. The failure was engineered. Thomas had been on that bridge because his route home from the Southern Survey ran across it. He'd taken Rose because Rose had come to meet him. She'd ridden out on the small mare she loved because she wanted to ride home with her father in the evening, something she'd done since she was small. They'd gone into the Redstone Creek because a beam gave way under the weight of a wagon that a professional had quietly ensured would give way, not an accident, rain and dark, and the awful randomness of the world. A decision someone had decided. She folded the papers, put them back in the folder, tied the knot, the ranger's knot, careful and precise, and placed it in the cedar box with the other documents. Then she sat in the underground room for a while longer, not paralyzed, not lost thinking. 15 years in the Federal Rangers had taught her several things beyond wildlife tracking and terrain reading, and how to pry open a padlocked filing cabinet. It had taught her that evidence was only useful if it could be delivered to someone with the authority to act on it. It had taught her that problems solved by emotion alone generally created additional problems. And it had taught her that when you were in unknown territory with a threat you didn't fully understand, you needed to know two things: what you were dealing with and who was coming for you. She had a partial answer to the first question. She needed to think carefully about the second. She came back up through the floorboard, replaced the board, looked around the cabin in the last of the evening light. The lion was at the window again. Not watching Martha this time, watching the tree line. Martha crossed to the window and looked out, nothing moving, nothing visible. But the lion's ears were forward and still. The particular stillness of an animal that has detected something its senses have identified as significant, even if the source isn't visible yet. Martha looked at the ground beyond the porch, there, at the edge of the clearing, where the trail bent around a stand of spruce, fresh in the soft earth, horseshoe prints, not from the four men. Those had come from the other direction. These were from one horse, different shoe pattern. Had come up from the east trail, paused at the edge of the trees, and then backed away. Someone else had been here, watching, and had left before Martha came up from the cellar. She looked at the prints for a long time. Then she looked at the mountain around her, the dark coming down through the trees, the first stars showing above the eastern ridge. She was on a mountain that held a secret worth $40 million, a secret that had already gotten Thomas killed and had made Elias Drum disappear, a secret that 4 armed men were planning to come back for tomorrow. And someone she didn't know about yet had just been standing at the edge of her clearing, watching. Martha went inside, built a fire, small, careful, just enough for warmth. Made coffee on the hearth. Found a tin of hardtack in her pack and ate it without tasting it, because eating was maintenance, and she was currently in maintenance mode. The lion had moved back to the bedroom. Martha could hear the cubs. Soft sounds, contented sounds now. Settled for the night, she sat by the small fire with the cedar box in her lap. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he'd looked when he came in from the shed. That morning, sawdust on his shirt, proud in the quiet way he was proud of things. She thought about Rose, on the small mare, riding out to meet him. She thought about the word engineered. Then she thought about the last line of Elias's letter. She'd read it 4 times by now. She didn't need to read it again. She looked at the cedar box, at the bird on the lid, wings open, mid-flight. "All right," she said again, quietly, to the fire or to Thomas or to the mountain pressing in around the cabin walls. All right. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that lawyer's office in Denver. She wasn't sure who she was yet, but she was beginning to understand what she was here to do. She banked the fire, checked the door, checked the window, checked the floorboard was seated properly. Then she lay down on the narrow rope bed, still made up with Elias's blankets, still holding the shape of someone who'd slept in it regularly. And she stared at the ceiling and let her mind move through what she knew and what she was going to need to find out. The lion settled in the next room. The cubs made small sounds and went quiet. The mountain went dark around them. Martha Calloway, 43 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch, owner of a $5 cabin and a box full of evidence that had already killed one man and disappeared another, closed her eyes, slept for the second night in a row. Solidly. Which was, she supposed, what happened when a person finally understood what they were meant to be doing. Outside, the hoof prints at the edge of the clearing filled slowly with the first dusting of October snow. And somewhere further, down the mountain, in the dark, the man who'd made them was also thinking about tomorrow. She woke before dawn with the feeling that something had changed. Not inside the cabin. Outside, the mountain had a different quality of silence, full of something holding its breath. Martha was on her feet before she'd finished the thought. Boots on in 30 seconds. Ranger habit. Boots always within arm's reach, always. She crossed to the window and looked out through the gap in the curtain. Gray pre-dawn light. The clearing dusted with last night's snow. An inch, maybe less. Enough to be a record of everything that had moved across it since midnight. She looked at the record. 2 sets of boot prints. Coming from the east trail. Stopping 20 feet from the cabin. Standing there, she could see the deeper impression where weight had shifted, where someone had stood and waited and then retreating. Back the way they came. Sometime in the last 2 hours, someone had come back and decided not to knock. She stood at the window for a moment and thought about what that meant. A man who came close and left without announcing himself was either cautious or uncertain. Neither of those was the same as gone. The lion appeared in the bedroom doorway, looked at Martha, looked at the window, looked back at Martha. I know. Martha, she went to the desk, opened the cedar box, looked at the letter one more time, not reading it, just holding it. The way you hold something you've committed to memory but aren't ready to put down. Then she put on Thomas's coat, took the long hunting knife from her pack. She'd carried it since her first backcountry posting, never needed it for anything more dramatic than cutting rope, but you carried it anyway, and went out the front door. Cold, sharp and immediate, cold that clarified things. She moved off the porch and circled wide around the cabin, staying at the edge of the tree line, reading the snow as she went. 15 years had made her good at this, reading what the ground remembered. The boot prints from the east told their story clearly. 2 men, one heavier than the other. His prints sank deeper. They'd come up the trail, split at the tree line, one going slightly north and one slightly south, to widen their angle of view, then converged again, stood, wait, left, deliberately left, unhurried, not startled away, observing. She followed the retreat trail, back 50 yards into the trees, found where horses had been tied. 3 horses, from the hoof prints, though only 2 men had approached on foot. They'd come prepared to leave fast. Professionals, but not the same professionals as yesterday. The boot pattern was different. The approach angle was different. Yesterday's men had come from the main western trail. These had come from the east, secondary trail, harder route, which meant they knew the mountain well enough to find it. 2 separate groups, both watching the cabin. Martha stood in the trees and thought about $40 million worth of silver beneath the ground she was standing on. Then she went back inside. She made coffee. Because thinking was better with coffee. This was not a complicated philosophy, but it had served her well. She went down through the floorboard, second drawer of the filing cabinet. More correspondence, but different in tone from the mineral surveys. These were letters, received letters, folded and preserved, and as she read them by lamplight in that stone room, the shape of what Elias had uncovered became larger and more serious with every page. The letters were connected to a man named Harlan Voss, not signed by him directly. The signatures were a series of initials that meant nothing to her, but Elias had written a name on the outside of the folder in his careful hand, H. Voss, Voss Silver Company, Denver, founded 1871. C.M. Emdar, U.S. Army, retired 1865, and beneath the name, a single line. He gave the order for the bridge. Martha sat very still in the underground room. She read the letters. They were written in the language of business. Careful language. The language of a man who understood that written words were evidence and had taken considerable care to say things without saying them. Discussions of the obstruction on the Eastern Survey route. References to resolving the access problem. A note about the matter of the Redstone land being addressed satisfactorily as of October 1878. The month Thomas and Rose went into the creek. One letter was different from the others, shorter, more direct. Written in a different hand from the responses. Written by Voss himself, she thought, from the decisive quality of the penmanship. The ranger knew too much and spoke too freely. This cannot be allowed to continue. Use whatever method is cleanest. The land must be clear by spring. She read it 3 times. The ranger knew too much, Thomas. Thomas had been on that land, had been surveying it for the federal government, had been filing reports about unusual activity in the Silver Peak drainage. She remembered that now, half-remembered conversations over dinner. Thomas frustrated about something he'd seen that he couldn't quite categorize. She hadn't paid close enough attention. She'd been distracted by her own work, her own cases, the ordinary noise of a life being lived. She put the letter down on the stone floor, picked it back up, folded it and put it in the cedar box, because whatever happened next, this letter went with her. She was back upstairs, standing at the window with the cedar box under her arm, when she heard them, hoofbeats. This time from the west, multiple horses, moving faster than yesterday. The sound of people who'd made a decision and were implementing it. She had maybe 3 minutes. She looked at the lion in the bedroom doorway. She looked at the floorboard. She looked at the front door and the back of the cabin, and the 2 windows and the specific geometry of the problem she was standing inside. Then she heard the voice, outside, not shouting, not threatening, just carrying. The voice of a man who expected to be heard, Mrs. Calloway. She went still. He knew her name. My name is Silas Merck. I work for Harlan Voss. I'd appreciate a conversation, she said nothing. I can see smoke from your fire, so I know you're in there. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'd appreciate if we didn't waste time on that kind of thing. A straight talker. Interesting. She moved to the window, looked out, 5 men on horseback. One slightly forward, the one who'd spoken, late 30s, trail-worn face, a lean that came from years of choosing hard over easy. He was sitting his horse with the easy authority of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, and the particular stillness of someone who'd also spent years in situations where moving suddenly could get you shot, former military. She'd seen that bearing before. The other 4 were spread in a loose arc behind him, all armed. None of them with weapons drawn, professional, organized. Not here to be dramatic about it. I have business with the documents Elias Drum left here, Merck said. Still that same carrying conversational tone. I'd rather discuss it than not. Martha's mind was doing several things at once. Part of her was calculating distances and angles, and the specific problem of 5 armed men, and one of her. Part of her was thinking about the letter. The ranger knew too much. Part of her was thinking about Elias's letter, about what he'd understood about her before they'd ever met, and a small, tired part of her was thinking, Thomas, I hope you're watching this, because this is absolutely not what I planned for my 40s. She went to the door, opened it, stood in the doorway. She was aware of what she looked like to people who weren't expecting her. She'd been aware of it since she was 15. She'd stopped apologizing for it around 30. Now she just let it be what it was. 6 feet and 1 inch of stillness in a dead man's coat, which wasn't passivity, and people generally figured that out quickly. She watched Silas Merck's expression make a small, involuntary adjustment. Good, you can come in, she said. One man. You. A pause. The others stay on their horses, she added. I'll know if they dismount. Merck looked at her for a moment. Then he swung down from his horse and handed his reins to the man beside him. He walked to the porch steps, stopped at the bottom. Your hands, she said. He showed her both palms. Empty. She stepped back into the cabin. He came up the steps and through the door. He was taller than he'd looked on horseback, and he moved carefully, deliberately. Not tiptoeing, he wasn't afraid, but he was paying attention to everything. His eyes went to the room the way eyes go when they're trained to assess a space. He noticed the fireplace, the desk, the cedar box on the desk. He looked at it for just slightly too long. Sit down, Martha said. He sat, the chair by the desk. She stayed standing, which meant he had to look up at her, which she didn't mind. You know who Harlan Voss is, Merk said. I'm learning. Then you know what he wants. Documents. Survey records. She paused. Evidence. Something moved across Merk's face. Yes, evidence that he ordered the bridge at Redstone Creek to be cut. The room went very quiet. Merk looked at her. She watched him do the calculation. What she knew. What that meant. What his options were. How much did Drum leave you? He said finally. Enough. Another calculation. Then, I didn't know about the bridge. She said nothing. I'm telling you that because it's true. Not because I expect you to believe it. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the posture of a man being direct. I've worked for Voss for 4 years. I knew about the land surveys. I knew about the operation on the federal land. That's... He stopped. Started again. That's the kind of thing a man tells himself is business. Complicated business. Not something you put your name on in the light of day, but not murder. Martha said. He didn't look away, not murder. She studied him. The thing about 15 years in the backcountry was that you spent a lot of time reading things that couldn't speak. Tracks and weather, and the behavior of animals at the edge of their tolerance. You developed a sense for the difference between something that was what it appeared to be and something that wasn't. Silas Merk was a man in a specific kind of trouble, the kind that came from serving one thing for long enough that it had become part of your identity. And then finding out that the thing you served was not what you'd told yourself it was. She knew something about that particular trouble, though hers had come from a different direction. There's something you want to tell me, she said. His jaw tightened. There's a name in Drum's files. Decker Holt. She waited. Decker was my lieutenant. When I mustered out in '65, we stayed in contact. He went to work in the mining industry. For Voss. Eventually, Merk's voice was level. But the levelness was a controlled thing, not a natural one. Voss told me 2 years ago that Decker had gone east, had family there, moved on. And I found his name in a folder in the cedar box yesterday. While you were downstairs, she'd left the box on the desk. He'd looked through it. She should have expected that. The folder Drum marked with red, Merk said. Names, dates, manner of death. She had found that folder. A list of 8 names. Elias's handwriting. Each entry brief and precise. Decker, Holt, March 1877. Ruled accidental, horsefall. Inconsistent with injuries, he didn't go east, Merk said. No, Martha agreed. The room was quiet again. The fire had burned low. Outside, she could hear the other 4 men shifting on their horses. Waiting, Merk looked at his hands. I need to know what Drum found. All of it. Not because Voss sent me here, he looked up. Because I need to know what I've been part of. Martha looked at him for a long time. The lion appeared in the hallway doorway. Both of them went still. The lion looked at Merk with the same evaluating patience she'd shown Martha on the first day. Those golden eyes moving over him slowly. Measuring Merk didn't reach for a weapon, didn't make a sudden movement. Just sat very still and let himself be assessed. Which was, Martha thought, the correct thing to do. After a moment, the lion turned and went back to her cubs. She decides you're a threat, Martha said. There's nothing I'll be able to do about it. Understood, Merk exhaled slowly. She make that judgment often? First time I've seen her go either way on a person. Martha pulled a chair to the other side of the desk and sat down. Start talking. Tell me what Voss knows about this mountain and how long he's known it. He talked for nearly an hour. The story that came out was the one Elias's files had suggested, but fuller. Voss Silver Company had been operating on the fringe of the Silver Peak drainage for 3 years. Legitimate surface claims on the lower slopes, and beneath that, illegal survey operations on federal land, conducted at night in sections remote enough that the rangers rarely patrolled them. Thomas had been the ranger who patrolled them. Thomas had noticed the signs of survey work, had filed a report. The report had been quietly buried by someone in the Denver Federal Office who was on Voss's payroll. Thomas had filed a second report and requested an investigation. And then, Voss had made his decision about the ranger who knew too much. He's coming here, Merk said. Martha went still. When? 2 days. Maybe 3. He doesn't trust the results from the survey teams. He wants to see the deposits himself. Merck's voice was careful, neutral, and he wants whatever drum left here. All of it. He knows I'm here? He knows a woman bought the property. He doesn't know what you know. A pause. He didn't think a widow buying a $5 cabin was worth worrying about. The particular contempt in that sentence. Not Merck's contempt, Voss's contempt. The contempt of a man who'd looked at Martha Calloway and seen an obstacle too minor to assess carefully, settled somewhere in her chest like a coal, finding its place in a great good. Underestimated was a position she could work with. You said you didn't know about the bridge, she said. I'm going to act as if that's true. For now, that's fair. What I need from you is information about the men outside, who they'll follow and who they won't. Merck looked at her steadily. 2 of them are mine. They'll do what I say. The other 2 answer directly to Voss's foreman. Can they be sent away? I can give them a reason to ride back to the lower camp. They won't question me. He paused. Not for another day, anyway. Do it. He looked at her. And then you help me understand what I'm looking at in those files. Because you know this operation and I know federal land law and evidence handling. Between us, we might be able to build something that survives a courtroom. You're talking about a trial. I'm talking about evidence. Delivered to a judge who isn't on Voss's payroll. She met his eyes. Is there one of those? Something moved in his face. Something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to have somewhere to go. There might be. There's a federal judge in Denver. Archibald Fenn. Old. Stubborn. I've heard Voss avoid his name carefully, which usually means he can't touch him. Martha thought about Elias's letter. The phrase she'd read and filed away. I have taken precautions with a man in Denver, whose integrity I would stake my life on, Judge Fenn, she said. Merck looked at her. You've heard of him. Elias Drum trusted him. She stood up. Send your men back to camp, all 4 of them. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. Then come back inside. He stood, looked at the cedar box. That stays with you. Everything stays with me. He nodded once. Went outside. She listened to him talk to the 4 men. The conversation was brief. She couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear. Direction given, direction accepted. After a moment, hoofbeats. 4 horses, moving down the western trail. Merck came back in alone. They spent the rest of the morning in the underground room. Merck moved through Elias's files with the focus of a man who'd made a decision and was following it through to its conclusion. He knew the company's operations from the inside. He could match dates in the files to things he'd witnessed directly. He could identify which of the shell company names in the correspondence were real operations and which were fronts for moving money. Martha took notes. The same way she'd taken notes on 15 years of ranger work, precise, organized, building towards something she couldn't yet fully see, but was assembling piece by piece. The picture that emerged was ugly and large. Voss Silver Company was not the only entity involved. The illegal surveys had been conducted in partnership with 2 other mining concerns, both operating under names that appeared legitimate on the surface. The network of bribery extended into the Federal Land Office, the Denver court system, and, based on one letter Elias had marked with a double underline, a member of the territorial governor's staff, hundreds of thousands of dollars had changed hands, not all of it from mining. Some of it from the sale of survey data. Information about what lay under federal land, sold to buyers who could use it before any legitimate claim was ever filed. And woven through all of it, the systematic removal of anyone who got close enough to see the whole shape of it. 8 names on Elias's list. Thomas and Rose had not been on that list, which meant Elias hadn't been certain enough to include them, which meant he'd found the bridge evidence later, which meant the list of people Voss had decided were obstructions was probably longer than 8. Martha put her pencil down, picked it back up, kept writing. Around midday, Merck looked up from a folder. There's something I need to tell you. Say it. The 2 men who came from the East Trail last night. Before dawn, she looked up. You know about that. I sent them. He held her gaze. I wanted to know if you'd found the files before I came in this morning. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The room was quiet. "And," she said, "and the cabin had a fire burning and someone was moving inside. And they could see through the window gap that you were reading by lamplight at 2 in the morning." He paused, which told me what I needed to know, that I'd found them, that you weren't going to walk away. She thought about that. "Were those your orders, to come here and take the files, or something else?" Merck's jaw set. "Take the files, and ensure no one remained who could contradict whatever story Voss decided to tell about Drum's disappearance." The words sat in the room. "Ensure no one remained." She'd understood on some level since yesterday. Since she'd read the list of 8 names in Elias's folder. She'd understood what kind of problem she was to Harlan Voss. Hearing it stated plainly was different. "You decided not to follow those orders," she said. "I decided." He stopped. Started again. Decker Holt was 29 when he died. He had a daughter in Pueblo. "I've been sending her money every year because I told myself it was the decent thing to do for a man who'd moved on." His voice was even. Controlled. "I've been sending blood money to a dead man's daughter and calling it decency." Martha looked at him. He looked back. "So no," he said. "I didn't follow those orders." Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the pines. Not quite a howl. Not quite a whisper. Something between. Meaning the weather was making its second decision of the day. She watched him for another moment. She'd made a provisional decision about Silas Merck this morning when she decided to open the door. The kind of decision you made when the alternative was doing everything alone and the clock was running. She could be wrong about him. She'd been wrong about things before. But Decker Holt had a daughter in Pueblo who'd been getting money every year from a man who called it decency. That told her something. Not everything, but something. "Voss comes in 2 days," she said. "Maybe sooner if teams report back that the cabin is occupied. Then we need to move faster than 2 days." She spread the map on the floor between them. The survey map of the mountain, showing all the trails. She put her finger on a route she'd identified this morning that ran northeast, away from both the western and eastern trails Voss's men were using. "There's a postal relay at the bottom of this drainage," she said. 4 hours on foot, maybe 2.5 on horseback. "If we can get a message to Judge Fenn in Denver." "Fenn is already involved," Merck said. "He said it the way a person says something they've been holding. Drum was in contact with him. I found out 3 weeks ago." He paused. "That's partly why Drum disappeared when he did. Voss found out Drum had made contact with a federal judge. He moved before Drum could deliver whatever he was building. Is Fenn coming here? I don't know. If Drum reached him in time, possibly. But there's a man in the local sheriff's office who's on Voss's payroll and can delay a federal party at the county line with paperwork. For how long? 3 days. Maybe 4. Martha looked at the map. At the relay route. At the timeline building itself in her mind. Voss in 2 days. Judge Fenn potentially 3 days out. A gap of at least 24 hours where she had evidence that could end a man's empire, and that man was on his way to take it. Upstairs, she heard the lion moving. The sound of her crossing the main room, going to the window. Martha had started to read that animal's behavior like a second language. The lion moved to the window when something outside needed attending to. "Company," she said. Merck was on his feet before she finished the word. They came up through the floorboard. Martha replaced it, crossed to the window. 3 riders. Not from the west trail this time. They'd come up through the forest itself, off trail, pushing through the tree line from the south, moving slowly, carefully. The horses were tired. These weren't Voss's men. One of the riders was old, white-haired, sitting his horse with the particular upright posture of a man who'd been riding for 60 years and had opinions about how it should be done. The other 2 were younger, both wearing coats that said federal business without saying it. The old man looked up at the cabin. He looked at the window where Martha was standing. He raised one hand, slowly, a formal gesture. Like a man who'd been told who he was coming to see and was acknowledging that he'd arrived. Martha turned to Merck. "Does Archibald Fenn have white hair? Rides like he owns the territory?" Something crossed Merck's face. Relief. And something else. Something complicated, that's him, he said. Martha exhaled one day early. Which meant Elias had reached him. Which meant whatever Elias sent, it had been enough to make an old federal judge push through Colorado mountain terrain in October rather than wait for the road to be clear. She went to the door, opened it. The old man on the horse looked at her across the clearing. He looked at her and her coat and the cedar box tucked under her arm in the way that said she wasn't putting it down for anything. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, the voice of a man who'd spent decades in courtrooms, carrying precise, used to being heard. "Judge Fenn," she said. "Mr. Drum told me to look for the Iron Woman of Silver Peak." He paused. "Said I'd know her when I saw her." She didn't smile, but something in her chest moved. "Get your horses into the trees. West side, off the trail. How did you get past the county line?" "We came up the northeastern drainage." Longer route. He was already moving his horse toward the tree line, which told her he understood the need for concealment without her having to explain it. "We have perhaps 18 hours before Voss realizes I'm not where he thinks I am. Then we need to work fast." He dismounted with the ease of a man 20 years younger, handed his reins to one of the younger men and walked toward the porch. He was shorter than she'd expected. But the way he moved across the clearing, direct, deliberate, without looking at the ground, had a gravity to it that made the shortness irrelevant. He climbed the porch steps. Stopped. The lion was in the doorway. Judge Archibald Fenn looked at the mountain lion for a long moment. The mountain lion looked at Judge Archibald Fenn. "Good Lord," he said quietly. Not frightened. The tone of a man encountering something that demanded acknowledgement. "She lives here," Martha said. "She's decided I'm acceptable. Jury's still out on everyone else." Fenn looked at the lion for another beat. "Then, I've faced more dangerous things in my courtroom." He took one slow, deliberate step forward. The lion stepped aside, not far. Just enough. Fenn came inside. Martha made coffee. "Because there was a federal judge in her borrowed cabin, and a murdered husband to account for, and 18 hours to build a case that could survive a courtroom. And none of that was getting done without coffee." She put the cedar box on the desk. Fenn sat across from it, put his reading glasses on, looked at the carved bird on the lid. "Elias made that," he said. "He carved it to match Thomas's pattern." She pushed the box toward him. "He sent you something. What did he say when he reached you?" "He sent a letter. 3 weeks ago." Fenn opened the box carefully. He described what he'd found in broad terms. "He said the documents at the cabin would provide the specifics." He looked up. "He said if he sent more than that in writing, it wouldn't reach me safely." "He was right." She paused. "He disappeared the week after he sent you that letter." Fenn went very still. "We don't know if he's dead," Merck said from the corner. He'd been quiet since Fenn arrived, standing back, letting it unfold. Fenn looked at Merck with the evaluating eyes of a man who knew what side Merck had been standing on until recently. "And you are offering testimony against Voss?" "Yes." "Your name?" "Silas Merck." "Former lieutenant, 3rd Colorado Cavalry. 4 years employed by Voss Silver Company." Fenn looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that testimony from a man in your position requires corroboration." "Everything in those files corroborates everything I know," Merck said. "We spent the morning matching them." Fenn turned back to the cedar box. Started reading. Martha poured coffee, set cups on the desk. Fenn didn't look up from the papers. He read the way she imagined he worked through everything. Thorough, unhurried, without visible reaction. The face of a man who'd been processing difficult information in a professional context for 40 years, and had learned to feel it later. When he got to the letter about the ranger who knew too much, he stopped. Set the paper down, picked up his coffee, drank, set it down, picked the paper back up. "Your husband," he said. Not a question. "Yes. And your daughter was with him, Rose?" "She was 17. Fenn was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway." She nodded. Once. The way she'd learned to accept condolences, briefly, so they didn't stay in the air too long. "I want to show you the bridge diagram," she said, "and the witness notation. There's a timber section Elias mentions. He says he has it. If he was hiding somewhere on this mountain, when Voss moved against him, it might still be accessible. Fenn looked at her over his glasses. You think Drum is still alive? She thought about the careful, detailed, deeply thorough preparation of everything she'd found in the underground room. She thought about the cedar box with the carved bird. She thought about a man who'd spent 3 years building something he intended to be used. I think he's the kind of man who planned for every contingency, she said, including having to wait. Fenn looked at the papers again. If he's alive and we can locate him, and if the timber section isn't intact, we have a case. He paused. A real one. I'll also be recommending, in my report, a formal ranger post at Silver Peak, Fenn added, still looking at the letters. Federal land needs oversight. And someone who knows this mountain. He didn't look up when he said it. Didn't need to. Voss arrives in 2 days. Merk said. Fenn looked up. Then we have 2 days. He removed his glasses, polished them with the focused attention of a man buying time to think. Where would Drum have gone if he needed to hide quickly? If he understood that Voss knew he'd contacted me? Martha looked at the survey map on the desk, at the terrain notation in Elias' careful hand, at one marking on the eastern ridge that had no label but was circled twice. She noticed it this morning and hadn't known what to do with it. She was beginning to. There are caves on the eastern slope, she said. Natural formation. Elias marked them on the map. She put her finger on the double circle. He marked this one differently than the others. Fenn looked at the map. You think he's there? I think if I were a man who'd spent 3 years on this mountain and needed to disappear for a few weeks and knew every inch of the terrain. She traced the route from the cabin to the double-circled mark. I think that's where I'd go. The lion came in from the front room, settled near the fireplace. Her cubs appeared behind her, tumbling, briefly chaotic, then settling against her sides. Fenn watched them with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Something between wonder and the particular weariness of a man who'd seen a great deal of the worst human beings could do to each other and hadn't expected to find this. How long have they been here? He asked. She was here when I arrived, Martha said. The cabin was her den, and she lets you stay. She made that decision the first night. Fenn was quiet for a moment. Elias mentioned her, he said, in the letter. He said he'd been sharing the cabin with a mountain lion for 2 months, and it had changed his thinking about what constitutes a home. Martha looked at the lion, at the cubs pressed against her sides. She said, which was all she could manage, because something in that, the image of Elias Drum in this cabin, alone, trying to build a case against a man who'd murdered people and buried the evidence, sharing booths with a mountain lion who'd simply decided this was her place. Something in that cracked a small piece of the careful, controlled surface she'd been maintaining since the moment she'd read I don't believe Thomas died by accident. She turned away, looked at the map, collected herself. Because there was work to do and 18 hours, and a federal judge who needed all the information she had. The eastern route to the cave, she said. How familiar are you with mountain terrain, Judge? Fenn put his glasses back on. I have been riding through Colorado mountains since before you were born, Mrs. Calloway. She almost smiled. Almost. Then we go at first light, she said. All of us. Outside. The wind moved through the pines. The cubs shifted and complained about something in the way that cubs complain. Briefly, and with total conviction, the fire settled, and somewhere on the eastern slope of Silver Peak, in a cave that a careful man had circled twice on a map and never labeled, someone was either waiting to be found, or wasn't. Martha intended to find out which. She spread the map flat. Merk moved to one side of it. Fenn moved to the other, and they began to plan, because Harlan Voss was 2 days out, and 2 days was enough. If they moved right, if they moved now, they left before dawn, 4 of them. Martha in front because she knew the terrain, and because no one suggested otherwise. Merk behind her, carrying the cedar box wrapped in oilcloth against the morning damp. Fenn's 2 deputies at the rear, moving quietly for men in official coats. Fenn himself in the middle. Which put him, Martha realized after the first half-mile, exactly where he could see everything and be protected from both directions, without having asked for that arrangement. A man who understood positioning without making it obvious, 67 years old. Moving through pre-dawn mountain terrain like it owed him something. She revised her estimate of him upward. The eastern route was harder than the western trail. Steeper, less cleared. An animal trail that men used when they didn't want to be seen using the easier one. Martha read it as she walked, reading the ground, reading the brush, reading the way the frost had settled and where it hadn't, which told her about air movement and shelter, and the specific geometry of this particular piece of mountain. The double-circled mark on Elias's map was 2 miles from the cabin as the crow flew. 4 miles as the mountain insisted. She didn't hurry them. Hurry on terrain like this was how people twisted ankles and made noise, and arrived somewhere out of breath and useless. She thought about Elias Drum instead. 3 years on this mountain, building a case piece by piece in an underground room, while a mountain lion raised cubs in the bedroom above him. Writing letters in careful handwriting. Carving a bird on a box because he wanted one grieving woman to know, before she read a single word, that the person who'd sent it understood what she'd lost. She'd been irritated by that, at first, the presumption of it. A stranger deciding he understood her grief well enough to use it as a doorway. She was less irritated now, because he'd been right. And being chosen correctly, even by a stranger, was its own kind of thing. Not comfort exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sky went from black to the particular dark blue that preceded dawn. The birds began their noise. A great horned owl made its last announcement of the night from somewhere in the pines above them, and then went silent. Martha stopped, held up a hand. Everyone stopped behind her. She was looking at the rock face ahead. The map had shown a cave entrance at the base of an outcropping. A natural formation, a place where the mountain had folded into itself and left a gap. She could see the dark shape of it from here. What she couldn't see from here was whether anyone was in it. What she could see was a mark on the rock face beside the entrance. Small, deliberate, made with the pointed end of something metal, recently enough that the scored rock was still pale against the weathered gray. A bird, wings open, mid-flight. Same bird, she exhaled. Behind her, she heard Merk say very quietly, "He's in there." She moved forward. The cave entrance was low. She had to duck, which was not her preferred mode of entrance into any space, but she managed it without comment. The tunnel beyond was larger. Rough stone walls. Natural formation, but someone had cleared the floor of loose rock and debris. Made it habitable. Minimal, deliberate. A man who knew how to live rough, and was doing it with purpose rather than desperation. A lamp burned low at the back, and beside it, wrapped in blankets against the cave cold, a man, 61 years old from what Elias's letter had said. He looked older. 6 weeks in a mountain cave would do that. But the eyes that came up when he heard them enter were clear and sharp and immediately assessing. He saw Martha first. He looked at her for a moment, her coat, the way she was standing, and something moved in his face. Something that had been held tight for a long time. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was rougher than the handwriting had suggested. "Months of cold and disuse, Mr. Drum," she said. Then he saw Fen behind her. He tried to stand. Got halfway up before his legs decided that 6 weeks of limited movement had opinions about this. Martha crossed the cave in 3 steps and got a hand under his arm. He looked up at her. She was a full head taller than him, even with him half standing and her half crouching in the low spaces. "I knew you'd be tall," he said. Thomas always mentioned it like it was the first thing you'd want to know about a person. Her throat tightened. Just slightly. "Can you walk?" she said. "Give me 10 minutes, and I'll walk out of here, myself." "You've got 5, he almost smiled. Thomas also said you were impatient. Thomas was generous. She got him upright, steady, stepped back. He looked at Fen, Archibald, Elias. Fen crossed the cave and took his hand. The handshake of 2 men who'd trusted each other across a significant distance for a significant amount of time. "You look terrible. I've had better months." He looked around at the group, stopped on Merk. Merk held his gaze. "I'm not here for Voss, a long beat. The files," Elias said, "I read them." Merk's voice was flat and even. "All of them. Another beat, Decker Holt, Elias said. Yes. Elias studied him for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned away. Because he was a man who understood that the accounting for certain things could wait until later, and the work had to happen first. Martha liked him immediately. The timber section, she said. You wrote that you had it, back of the cave. Wrapped in canvas, he pointed. I brought it up here the week before Voss moved. I knew if he found out about Fenn, he'd come for the cabin. She went to the back of the cave, found it. A section of beam, maybe 4 feet long, wrapped in painted canvas and tied with rope, heavy. She got both arms under it and lifted. Which was not elegant, but it worked. There's a saw mark on the underside, Elias said. Midpoint. You can see where the cut was stopped. Left enough intact to hold under normal conditions, but not under the weight of a loaded wagon on wet wood. Fenn was already moving to look. One of his deputies produced a document case. Started taking notes. They worked in the cave for an hour. Elias, moving more freely as his legs remembered their purpose. Walking Fenn through the timeline, with the precision of a man who had been rehearsing it in his head for 6 weeks. Merck adding operational details from his 4 years inside Voss's organization. Martha held the beam and answered questions. When asked and thought about a wet October night 2 years ago, and a wagon, and a man, and a girl who'd gone out to ride home with her father. Not an accident, a decision. Someone had decided, and that someone was 2 days away, maybe less. She set the beam down carefully. We need to move this to the cabin. And we need a plan for when Voss arrives. Fenn looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Calloway, I want to be clear about something. When Harlan Voss arrives, this becomes a federal matter. It became a federal matter when he ordered my husband killed on federal land. Quiet, I'm not arguing that, Fenn said carefully. Good. She picked up the beam again. Then let's go. The walk back was slower. Elias needed the pace. Nobody said so. They just adjusted without discussion, the way people do when they've been in difficult situations together, long enough to stop needing to narrate every accommodation. Martha set the pace, which was slower than her natural pace, but faster than coddling. Elias kept up. It was mid-morning by the time they reached the cabin, which gave them, by Martha's estimate, 6 hours before Voss's earliest possible arrival. Enough, if they didn't waste any of it. Golden October light on the clearing, the pines bright with it. The snow from yesterday mostly gone, except for shadow pockets under the trees. The lion was on the porch. She looked at the group arriving across the clearing. Her eyes went to Elias and stayed there. Elias stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the lion on the porch. His lion. 6 weeks since he'd seen her. She'd been a fixture of his solitary mountain life, sleeping in his bedroom, watching him work from the window, bringing her cubs into the main room on cold nights, with the perfect domestic authority of someone who understood. This was their shared space. The lion looked at him, blinked once. Then she turned and went inside. Martha watched Elias's face. He looked away quickly, rubbed a hand across his jaw. She's fine, he said to himself as much as anything. She's fine. She's better than fine, Martha said. She has 3 cubs, and she ran 2 of Voss's men off this mountain without taking a scratch. Elias looked at her. She ran. Later, Martha walked toward the cabin. Come inside. We have work to do. They worked through the morning. Fenn and his deputies organized the files, categorizing, building the formal record of evidence that a trial would need. Merck sat with one deputy and gave a full statement, names, dates, operations he'd participated in or witnessed. He spoke for 2 hours without stopping and without looking away from the page he was dictating to. Martha and Elias sorted the final drawer of the filing cabinet, the one she hadn't fully emptied in the chaos of the first day. What they found there changed the shape of the case, not in the direction of smaller. He kept records of the payments, Elias said, his voice carefully neutral, to the federal land office, to the county judge, to... He stopped. Say it, Martha said. To a marshal. 2 marshals. He spread the papers on the desk. The counties south of here. They were running interference on any federal inspection request that came through. She looked at the papers, at the names, at the amounts. Large amounts. This wasn't a mining company, cutting corners. This was a system, built deliberately, over years, to ensure that a man like Harlan Voss could do what he wanted on federal land, and no official mechanism would ever reach him. "How long has he been doing this?" she said. "The earliest payment I found was 1872. Elias set the paper down. A year after he founded the company, he'd started building the protection network. Before he'd started the operation it was designed to protect. That was the thinking of a former military commander. You don't advance until your supply lines are secure." Martha looked at the cedar box on the desk, at the carved bird on the lid. She thought about Thomas filing his reports, writing them up carefully the way he did everything, thorough and precise, because he believed in the system he worked for. Believed that reporting something meant it would be investigated. Not knowing the system had been bought. Not knowing the reports were landing on a desk owned by a man on Voss's payroll. Not knowing that every word he put on official paper was being read by someone who told Voss exactly what the ranger on the Eastern Survey route had observed. Her hands were still on the desk. "Mrs. Calloway." Elias said quietly. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't have to be." She looked at him. He was watching her with the eyes of a man who'd spent 6 weeks alone in a cave thinking about a lot of things, including the people he'd put in the path of a very dangerous situation. "I chose this," she said. "I signed the document and climbed the mountain. You chose it without knowing what you were choosing. Nobody ever knows what they're choosing. They just choose." She straightened. "Thomas chose to file those reports. He knew something was wrong, and he kept reporting it because that was the right thing to do." She picked up the cedar box. "He was right, and we're going to make it count." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man, the best I knew." She set the box down and went back to the files. "Now help me find anything with Voss's direct signature on it." They found 3 letters with Harlan Voss's full signature, not initials, not company letterhead. His name. In the decisive penmanship she'd identified from the shortest of the letters in the first drawer. All 3 were instructions. All 3 described actions that had been carried out. And one of them, the shortest, the one she'd read and folded and put in the cedar box on that first morning, contained 17 words that would hold up in any courtroom in the country. The ranger knew too much and spoke too freely. Use whatever method is cleanest. Fenn held that letter for a long time when she brought it to him. "This is sufficient," he said finally. "Is it?" Combined with the bridge evidence and Merck's testimony and the payment records, he looked up. "Yes, Mrs. Calloway. This is sufficient." She nodded. Then she went to the window, because she'd heard something. Hoofbeats. From the Western Trail, not 4 horses this time, more. She counted by sound, the way she'd learned to count in the backcountry. By the rhythm. By the interval between strikes. By the weight signatures of different gaits. 8 horses. Maybe 10 moving at a deliberate pace, not hurrying, the pace of a man who expected to arrive and find things as he'd arranged them. "He's early," Merck said from behind her. 1 day early, which meant one of Voss's teams had reported back. Occupied cabin. Evidence possibly compromised, and Harlan Voss had decided not to wait. Martha turned to the room. Fenn was already putting papers back in their folders. His deputies were moving with efficient calm. Trained men, she noted, not just clerks in official coats. "Options," she said. "The documents are secured," Fenn said. "My authority as a federal judge is established and documented." When Voss arrives, Merck said, "he has 10 armed men and a federal judge doesn't stop bullets." Silence. "He's right," Martha said. "Voss didn't get this far by respecting institutional authority. He bought institutional authority. He cannot buy a sitting federal judge," Fenn said, with the particular tone of a man who knew exactly what he was. "No," Martha agreed, "but he can remove one and explain it later. He's done it before." She looked at Elias. "The timber section. Where is it?" "Main room. Behind the bookshelves," she thought fast. The geometry of the situation. 10 armed men. 4 of them, 5 with Elias, but Elias was barely ambulatory. 1 federal judge whose authority was real, but whose physical presence was not the protection they needed right now. The mountain. She went to the window and looked at the terrain. The Western Trail wound down through the forest. They'd see the riders in another 2 minutes, maybe 3. She looked at the tree line to the north, at the drainage beyond it where, this morning, she'd heard the sound she recognized from 15 years in the backcountry. A sound that had made her take note and set it aside to think about later. Wolves, the pack that had come down from the high country with the cold. She'd heard them 3 times in the last 2 days, moving through the drainage north of the cabin. The sound of an established pack doing what packs did, mapping the territory, marking the boundaries, assessing what had changed. A gunshot would bring them closer, not drive them away. An argument between 10 armed men and a federal judge in a cabin clearing would create exactly the kind of sustained noise and chemical disturbance. Gunpowder, fear-sweet, adrenaline that a predator pack found worth investigating. She wasn't going to wish that on Voss's men. But she wasn't not going to think about it, Merc, she said. You said 2 of Voss's team leaders respond to you. Would they still, before they see the other 8 riders? Possibly, he paused. After? I'm a man who didn't complete his assignment. I need them separated. I need Voss to come to the cabin, without his full complement. Merc looked at her steadily. You want me to go down the trail? I want you to go down the trail and tell 2 specific men that there's a problem on the eastern slope that needs their attention. And if they ask what problem, tell them a federal agent is holding the eastern route, which is true. She looked at Fenn's deputies. You 2, eastern slope. 1 mile out. Make yourselves visible to be a credible report. Fenn's deputies looked at Fenn. Fenn looked at Martha. You're a very organized person, he said. I was a ranger for 15 years, she said. You manage a lot of things by managing the terrain. He nodded to his deputies. They went out the back. Merc picked up his coat. And if Voss still comes with 8 men, then I'll have a conversation with 8 men instead of 10. She met his eyes. But I'd rather have it with 6. He almost smiled. It didn't quite finish the journey. Don't let him have the files, he said. I wasn't planning to. He went out. She watched him go down the trail through the window. Then she turned back to the room. Fenn stood in the middle of the cabin. Elias was at the desk, sorting the last of the papers, with the focused deliberation of a man who understood that order mattered. The lion had come in from somewhere. The front room, the porch. Martha hadn't tracked her entry, and was sitting near the fireplace with an expression of absolute territorial authority. 3 cubs tumbled around her feet. The sound of hoofbeats was very close now. Martha picked up the cedar box, looked around the cabin, at the bookshelves, at the desk, at the underground room whose entrance was invisible if you didn't know to look. She put the cedar box on the desk. Then she opened the front door and walked out onto the porch. She was going to stand in the open, in full view. On a porch she'd bought for $5, on a mountain she had 15 years of credentials to stand on. Not hiding, not running, because Harlan Voss had made a decision about a ranger who knew too much, and she had something to say about that. The riders came out of the tree line, 7 of them. Merc had gotten 2 away. Better odds than 10. Still 7 armed men and 1 of her. But Martha had long since stopped organizing the world around what it was supposed to look like, and started organizing it around what it actually was. Voss was easy to identify. He was in the center of the group on a large gray horse, wearing a coat that cost more than most men made in a season. 58 years old, straight in the saddle in the way that military service left on a person's spine, permanently silver-haired. The face of a man who'd spent decades making decisions and never personally dealt with the consequences. He was handsome. She hadn't expected that. And he was looking at her with the expression of a man who had arrived, expecting an obstacle, and found the obstacle to be significantly larger than his intelligence had indicated. He rode to the edge of the porch. Stopped, looked up at her. She looked down at him. Mrs. Calloway, he said, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms listening when he spoke. Smooth, measured, Mr. Voss. I'd like to discuss a business matter. I imagine you would. He looked at the cabin behind her, at the closed door, at the windows. She could see him doing the calculation. How many people inside? What were they armed with? What had she found and how much of it? The calculation of a man who'd been performing it for years. I have an interest in the mineral surveys conducted on this property, he said. I'd like to make you a fair offer for the transfer of those documents. They're not mine to transfer, she said, a small pause. Pardon? They're evidence in a federal case. She put her hands in her coat pockets. Deep and wide. Judge Archibald Fenn is inside. He arrived this morning. The documents have been entered into federal record. The quality of the silence that followed this was extraordinary. She watched it move through the 7 men, starting with Voss and radiating outward. Like a stone dropped in still water, Voss's face did not change, which was impressive. She'd give him that. Fenn doesn't have jurisdiction. He has precisely the jurisdiction granted by the federal survey statutes and the land acts of the last decade, which give him complete authority over criminal activity on federal land, including the land that borders and underlies this property. She held his gaze. He wrote the brief himself, this morning. Sitting at Elias Drum's desk. Another pause. Drum is dead, Voss said. Drum is inside having coffee. The silence this time was a different quality. Less controlled, that's not possible, Voss said. He's thinner than he was, Martha agreed. 6 weeks in a cave will do that. But his handwriting is still excellent, and his memory is perfectly intact. She watched Voss calculate again, faster this time. The edges of the smooth surface beginning to show strain. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was lower now, more direct. The voice beneath the polished one. I understand that you have certain information. I understand that it may appear to implicate various parties in actions that could be characterized incorrectly as improper. I want you to understand that whatever a story Drum has constructed around the events of the past year. My husband filed 6 reports, Martha said. He stopped. 6 reports about irregular survey activity in the eastern drainage of Silver Peak. Each one sent to the Federal Land Office in Denver. Each one received by a man on your payroll and never acted on. She took her hands out of her pockets. The last report he filed was 3 weeks before the bridge at Redstone Creek failed. Voss said nothing. I have those reports, she said. I have the payment records, showing who received money to suppress them. I have a letter with your signature ordering that the ranger who'd filed them be dealt with, using whatever method was cleanest. She looked at him steadily, and I have the beam from the bridge. The one your man cut partway through and left to fail. The 7 men behind Voss were very still. Mrs. Calloway. Voss's voice was quiet now, very controlled. The voice of a man operating at the absolute edge of that control. I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. I've been thinking about it for 2 days. She met his eyes. And I thought about it for 2 years before that when I believed it was an accident. She paused. It's clearer now. Something moved through his face. Not remorse. She wasn't expecting remorse. Something colder than remorse. The recalculation of a man who'd run out of the moves he'd prepared and was looking for ones he hadn't. He turned to the men beside him, a small gesture. Just a shift of his weight and a look, and Martha said, There are 2 federal deputies on the eastern slope, and a former Army lieutenant on the Western Trail who knows every name in your payment records and has been talking to Fenn's recorder since this morning. She paused. And there's a mountain lion directly behind you who has been watching this conversation with a great deal of interest. 6 of the 7 men turned around. The lion was on the porch rail. She'd come out silently, which was her nature, and positioned herself on the railing at Martha's right, approximately 3 feet from the nearest rider's horse. The horse noticed. The horse had opinions about this and communicated them energetically. 2 more horses responded to the first horse's opinions with opinions of their own. The organized group of 7 armed men became, very briefly, a significantly less organized group of 7 men managing horses that had just understood they were sharing a clearing with an apex predator. Voss controlled his gray, military training, good hands, but his eyes, when they came back to Martha, had changed. The calculation was gone. What was left was something harder and simpler. This isn't finished, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. It's going to take months in a courtroom and a great deal of testimony from a great many people. But that's where it's going. She stepped down one porch step. Eye level with him now. Almost. I want you to hear something from me directly, Mr. Voss. Not for the record. Not as evidence. Just for you, he waited. My husband believed in the work he was doing. He believed in the reports he filed. He believed the system he served was worth serving. She held his gaze. He was right about all of that. He was just wrong about you. She stepped back. Get off my mountain. Silence. The lion shifted on the porch rail. The gray horse Kamat took a sidestep. Voss looked at Martha for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin door, which had opened while they were talking, and through which Judge Archibald Fenn was now visible, standing in the doorway with the cedar box under one arm, and the bearing of a man who'd stood in front of considerably more intimidating things than a former military officer on a great horse. Voss looked at Fenn. Fenn looked back. Harlan, Fenn said, you'll want to come peacefully. For the sake of what remains of your reputation. Another long silence. One of the men behind Voss moved his horse sideways, away from the group, creating distance. Then another. The small physical language of men deciding that the thing they'd signed up for had become a different thing. Voss saw it. He sat very still in his saddle for a moment. Then he dismounted. He handed his reins to the man beside him, removed his coat, folded it over the saddle with the particular care of a man for whom the keeping of appearances was a lifelong practice. I'll need my lawyer, he said to Fenn. Denver has several good ones, Fenn said, though you may find their rates increase when they read the indictment. Martha came down the rest of the porch steps and stood aside while Fenn's deputies, appearing from the tree line, both of them, having come back from the eastern slope faster than expected, took charge of the situation with professional efficiency. Merck came up the western trail on foot 5 minutes later. He looked at the scene in the clearing, Voss standing by his horse, deputies in motion, the lion still on the porch rail, watching everything with her ancient particular patience. And he stopped walking. That fast, he said. He came with 7 instead of 10, Martha said, and she looked at the lion on the railing. At the gray horse, now calmer, being held by one of Voss's former men who seemed very eager to demonstrate cooperative intentions. And the mountain helped, she said. The rest of that day was documentation. That was what justice looked like from the inside, she was learning. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way that dramatic things were satisfying. Just work. Methodical, precise, careful work. Fenn sat at Elias's desk for 6 hours. His deputies wrote until their hands cramped. Merck talked until his voice gave out, and then they gave him water, and he kept talking. Elias organized. He moved through the underground room with increasing steadiness as the day went on, his legs remembering themselves, his mind fully engaged in the architecture of the case he'd spent 3 years building. Martha carried the beam from the bridge into the cabin and set it on the floor beside the fireplace, where the light was good. She looked at the saw mark, at the precise, deliberate line of it. The careful calculation of exactly how much to take and how much to leave. Enough to hold in normal conditions, not enough to hold when a wagon crossed it on a wet night. Someone had stood over this beam with a saw and made that cut. Someone had looked at a bridge that Thomas crossed regularly and made a decision about load and weather and wood fiber and how long it would take. She put her hand on the beam. The wood was cold. She left her hand there for a moment. Then she stood up and went back to work. Evening came slowly. Golden October light at that elevation, low and warm and particular. The light that made everything it touched look like it was being remembered, rather than seen for the first time. Voss was in Fenn's custody, technically speaking, though custody in a mountain cabin was a limited concept. He sat at the far end of the room and said nothing, and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who was working through something privately, and had no intention of sharing his process. Martha didn't look at him much. She didn't have a lot. She wanted to say to him that wasn't already in the evidence. She made dinner, practical decision. 8 people in a mountain cabin, a long cold night ahead, a long ride down to Denver in the morning. People needed to eat. She made it from what Elias had stored in the cabin: dried beans and salt pork and hardtack, and the last of the coffee, which she rationed with the focused attention the situation deserved. Elias sat at the table and watched her cook. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Somebody does. I didn't bring you here to cook. You brought me here to find evidence and protect it." She stirred the beans. "The evidence is found and protected. Now somebody has to cook." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas used to cook," she kept stirring. "He did. Better than me. He wrote about it in letters. He made it sound like the most important thing in the world, whatever was, for dinner. He wrote about Rose's favorite foods, with the detail of a man writing about treasure." Her throat tightened again, the same small tightening as this morning in the cave. She breathed through it. "Peach preserves on biscuits," she said. That was Rose's. She'd eat them at any meal and call it appropriate. Elias made a sound that was almost a laugh. He mentioned that. He found it hilarious every single time. She kept stirring. The fire settled. Outside, somewhere in the northern drainage, the wolf pack called to each other in the early dark. 3 voices, then more. The sound of a territory being mapped and confirmed at the end of a day. The lion raised her head from near the fireplace, listened, then put her head back down again. Her cubs were asleep against her sides. Martha looked at them, those 3 small shapes, born in this cabin, or near it. In the bedroom where Elias had slept, in the structure that Elias had built over years, in the mountain that held the silver and the secrets and the evidence and the bones of the decisions that powerful men made when they decided some people could be removed for the sake of their operations, born here anyway, alive anyway. She fed 8 people dinner in a mountainal cabin in October 1880, and nobody complained about the hardtack, and Fenn asked for more coffee twice, and Merc ate in silence but ate everything on his plate. Voss didn't eat. She put a plate beside him anyway. He looked at it, looked at her. She went back to the fire without saying anything. Because she wasn't going to feed him out of sympathy. She was feeding him out of the same reason she'd fed everyone else. Because it was practical. And because she was the person who had thought to do it. And because whatever else she was going to be after this, she wasn't going to be the kind of person who let someone go hungry to make a point. Thomas would have done the same. That mattered to her. They slept in shifts. Fenn's deputies took first and third. Martha took the second, midnight to 3, which was the watch she'd always preferred. The hours when the mountain was most honest about itself. Sat by the dying fire with the cedar box on the table and the lion sleeping nearby and the sound of the mountain doing what mountains did at night. Breathing, settling. She thought about the morning. Long ride down to Denver. Fenn would need to move fast. The network Voss had built didn't stop existing just because Voss was in custody. There were men on payrolls who would start moving the moment word got out. Evidence needed to reach people who were above the reach of Voss's money. Before those people had a chance to respond, she thought about what came after that. The trial. Months, Fenn had said. Long, complex. Fought at every step by the best lawyers Voss's money could retain. She would need to testify. Merc would need to testify. Elias would carry the bulk of it. 3 years of meticulous documentation was the spine of the case. But she would need to stand in a courtroom and say what she'd found, and when and what it meant. She found she didn't mind that. She thought about Thomas filing those 6 reports. About him believing, each time, that this one would be acted on. About him trusting the system. She was going to stand in that courtroom and be the system, working the way it was supposed to. That mattered. Around 3 in the morning, she heard Voss move. She was up before he took a second step which startled him. "I need air," he said. She looked at him. "One of your deputies is on the porch," she said. "Ask him." He started to say something. Stopped. Started again. "The reports," he said. "The Rangers' reports. I should tell you they were. There was a reason." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "I don't want an explanation," she said. "I want a trial." She held his gaze. "Go back to sleep." He went back to his corner. She sat down. The lion opened one eye, looked at Martha, closed it again, which felt, somehow, like agreement. Dawn came cold and clear. They packed what needed to go to Denver in organized parcels. The cedar box, the filing cabinet contents, in Fenn's document cases, the timber section wrapped back in its canvas and roped to a pack horse that one of the deputies had led up during the night. Martha stood on the porch and watched them organize the horses. Ilias came out and stood beside her. He stood beside her the way Elias stood beside most things. Like the fact of it was simply the fact of it, and commentary was optional. "What will you do?" he said. She looked at the mountain, at the clearing, at the trees where the first frost was catching the first light and turning briefly, for about 3 minutes every morning, into something she'd never found a word for. "I'll stay," she said. He looked at her. "This property is mine," she said. $5. Legal transfer. "And the federal land around it needs a ranger." She paused. "I have 15 years of credentials, and I'm not using them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The cabin could use some work, I noticed. The east-facing wall needs new chinking. I can do that. The floorboard over the cellar is a little obvious if you know what you're looking for. I'll leave it," she said. "Reminds me where things started." He was quiet again. "Thomas would have liked this mountain," he said. "He would have loved it." She watched the horses being organized below. "He would have wanted to know every tree on it by name." A pause. "Rose would have wanted to name them herself and override him." Ilias made that almost law sound. Below. Fenn was mounting his horse with the dignity of a 67-year-old man who was not going to ask for help. Merk was checking the ropes on the pack horse. The deputies were moving with efficient purpose. Voss was on a horse, flanked, looking at neither the mountain nor the people around him. "He'll have lawyers before we reach Denver." Elias said, "I know. The trial could take a year, I know. There are names in those files who are going to resist." "Elias," she looked at him. "I was a federal ranger for 15 years. I have spent the better part of those years working on problems that take longer than anyone wants and resist harder than anyone expects." She looked back at the clearing. "I know how to work on something for a long time." He nodded. The group was ready. Fenn looked up at the porch. "Mrs. Calloway." "I'll be in Denver before the first hearing," she said. "Send word when you have a date. You have my word." He gathered his reins. He turned his horse. The group moved. Martha stood on the porch and watched them go. 7 people and a pack horse and 1 man in custody, moving down the western trail through the golden October morning. The sound of hoofbeats fading in stages. Ilias was still beside her. "Your room's still available?" she asked. He blinked. Yes, I suppose technically. Good." She turned and went inside. "The east wall can wait until I've had coffee." He followed her in. The lion moved aside without being asked, in the way she had of making space that didn't look like yielding. The cubs woke up and had immediate loud opinions about the morning, which they shared with each other at considerable volume. Martha made coffee. She made it the way she always made it. Strong, no ceremony, the most practical version of a thing that was also, somehow, the best version. She brought 2 cups to the table, sat down across from Elias Drum. 61 years old, thinner than he'd been, eyes still sharp. A man who'd spent 3 years doing something difficult alone, and had chosen her to finish it, and had been right about that choice. She put the cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it. Outside, the hawk, the red tail she'd been tracking since the first morning, turned slow circles above the eastern ridge, riding the thermals that rose off the warming rock. The effortless motion of something exactly where it was meant to be, below the table. The cedar box sat on the floor, bird on the lid, wings open. Mid-flight, Martha drank her coffee. The mountain continued, as mountains did, without apology, without explanation, and with, she was beginning to understand, a certain amount of patience for the people on it who were finally, after a very long time, doing what they should have been doing all along.